There's nothing like an introduction where you don't actually have any idea what the person just said about you. So I don't really know where this could go. And on top of that, I don't really know exactly where my slides are going to go. So I ask you to forgive me a little bit, but we're gonna make do. So this is homemade ramen and threat intelligence. And I think why this presentation came about is kind of useful. I actually did this while I was interviewing for another job, sorry GitHub, where I was asked to talk about something I liked. Didn't matter, it could be work related, it could be not work related. And so I did something dumb and I talked about this with my friends. And they said, I said, well, I could do ramen or I could do threat intelligence. And one of my friends said, why not do both? So here it is. All right, this is me. This is a bunch of reasons you're supposed to listen to things that I say and trust the things that I tell you. I believe Alex might have gotten to some of those, maybe. Okay. And I will warn you, because I realize this is being translated, I'm going to try to avoid idioms, but I will definitely not be avoiding metaphor. Okay, I'm doing good back there. This entire talk is a big metaphor, so if that's not your kind of thing, this might not be the best talk for you. So first of all, what is ramen? And when you say this in the United States, it's a pretty loaded term. Ramen is something you eat in university because it costs about 80 cents. And it comes in this like weird squared off package, and it basically has this salt that's kind of strange and makes broth. And that's about it. And that's actually not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the much more traditional, built up kind of thing that you'll see in Tokyo and has made it to the United States. I understand there's a fairly big Japanese concentration in Brazil. I hate doing the whole like, can you raise your hand if you've had this, but I think this one's pretty tame. Who's had ramen? Oh, okay. Well, that's a much better cultural touchstone than I expected. So all right, so I'm gonna talk to you about how to make ramen the way I learned to make it. And on top of that, I'm going to talk about what threat intelligence is. Now, this is a very dangerous place for a speaker like me to get to, because this is an incredibly loaded term. So I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to talk about how to build a tactical threat intelligence capability that you could use to help improve a security operations center, the kind of thing that Sergio talked about a little bit earlier today, but really focused on how do you build a capability that lets you improve your ability to detect and respond to adversaries in your environment. So the goal throughout this talk, and what I was really trying to make sure the focus was on, was breaking this out into 4 things. Understanding tools, understanding inputs, understanding processes, and understanding people. To me, those are the 4 core ingredients you need in order to build threat intelligence. Sergio in his talk also alluded to the output of these things, which is products. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. But these are the 4 ideas you need to be thinking through as you're building an intelligence capability. And I'm sorry if in the back that's a little hard to read. But throughout this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to make ramen, and then I'm going to switch to how you make threat intel. I'm just going to go back and forth. Okay? So we'll start with tools. A description, I just did that, great. So here are the tools that I use for making ramen. Some pretty simple stuff, you know, knife and a cutting board for chopping up all the things, and by the way, there's a lot to chop up. You know, spider and your ladle for dealing with broth, and then tongs just because reaching into a 500-degree pot of water and pulling out ribs is not the best move you can ever make. By the way, I don't know, this is one of my favorite things on earth. This isn't something you actually need to make ramen, it's just really helpful. This is an infrared thermometer. It's basically a kitchen laser gun, and it's the best thing on earth because I can, you know, just zap and I know exactly how warm that is. Now these are the things that I think of when I'm working on making ramen, but really that's not it. I've actually got a lot of base infrastructure as well. I've got pots and pans. I've got the ability to get water out of a tap. I've got a stove where I can heat things up. That's going to be a useful thing in just a little bit. But the idea is I'm assembling all the different physical tools that I'm going to use as I start making ramen. And this is kind of the first thing I do as I get started. Threat intelligence has this same idea of tools, the things you need to kind of put together, the things you're going to need to process through the information that we're going to get to in a little bit. And again, like cooking, you're going to want to try to pull your tools together at the beginning. Now I want to be clear. There's a lot of vendors out there, and they're going to want you to buy their tool and tell you it's the best one and it's the only one, and you really can't do it without it. And maybe in some cases they're right. For my money, though, I like to start with the simplest tools I can. I like to pull stuff that's open source or free and use that until I can't use anything else. So I'm going to tell you about some of the tools that I like, that I've used, but the point is, it's not about the tool itself. It's about thinking what that tool enables you to do. And ultimately speaking, the very best tool is the one that you can successfully use to get done what you're trying to get done. So, first thing you generally think of when we're talking about threat intelligence is a TIP, a threat intelligence platform. One example, if you want to get started with this, is Yeti. There's a lot of others out there. There's probably someone out there that'll try to sell you one as well. But the idea is simply, a TIP is just a database. A TIP is a place where you take this information you collect via either your investigations or via your hunting, however you want to specify it, and get it all into one place to contextualize it and understand it. A TIP is kind of a collaborative notepad for your entire team. Now I say notepad very specifically, because if you have a small enough team, like one person, you might just have a pad of paper where you're writing things down. It won't scale terribly well, but the whole idea is you shouldn't be held back by your tools. You can get work done, you can create intelligence on a really basic set of tools. The next thing I look for is a workbench. So one example is Maltego. I like Maltego a lot. Thinking in graphs is a very natural thing to me for incident response and for threat intelligence. But this is just one example. The whole idea of a workbench is primarily focusing on how do you take inputs, beginning pieces of information, and make changes to them as you go through your investigation. So for instance, how do I track when I take an IP address and convert it to a domain name? And what I like about a workbench versus a TIP is when I think about a workbench, I'm thinking about something very in the moment, very transitive. Maltego's great. Another one that I've been using lately is Jupyter Notebooks, which is a very cool data science-y thing, so you can get that buzzword checked off. But Jupyter Notebooks provide another easy way to build code that shows those transforms as they work through. It's just another place you can kind of go to move that information around. You have the idea of detections. This is something, again, Sergio really touched on well, I thought. You need ways that you're going to take this information and make it useful to your security operations team. By the way, YAR and Snort are great, but the real key, again, is which ones are going to be useful to your incident response team. Nothing is going to frustrate people more than coming up with incident response or with YAR rules, only to find out your incident response team can't do anything with them. That's a good way to get a very frustrated incident response team. I think it's important when you're talking about tools to also acknowledge third-party tools. We go to a lot of these fairly regularly. Honestly, a little too much. I find a lot of threat intelligence teams are kind of unable to do things if they can't get access to things like VirusTotal, but they're important, and they're things that help provide context, help provide information, things that feed into your other tools. So something else to think about when you're starting to assemble tooling to build a threat intelligence capability is what are the third-party sources you're going to work off of. But I said at the beginning, and I think this is really the number one key, it's all about what's available inside your environment and what's going to be useful inside your environment. If you're in an Active Directory environment, that's an incredibly powerful source of information that you're going to want to be able to leverage. So tools are all about understanding your team, understanding your company, and how those two things can fit together. I did pull in a couple different quotes, and I really like this one from Daniel Boulud, who's a famous chef. Yeah, I'm keeping that food theme going here. So it's never the knife's fault. And I think this is really something to consider because I have known teams that think, well, we'll be able to do this as soon as we get a new SIM. We'll be able to do this as soon as we get Snort going. And I am the last one to say that those tools can't enhance your capability, but they should never limit it. Ingredients. I mean, again, it's cooking. This is about the most natural thing you can get to. And when you think about ingredients, what I'm thinking about is inputs. What comes into those tools? What are you going to process through to create intelligence? I mean, the beginning of intelligence, we have to do collection, pulling in disparate sources of information, and using those to work through a process. The tools enable that process. For ramen, we have a few different ingredients. We've got apples, we've got ginger, we've got garlic, soy sauce. I'll give you the recipe at the end. You don't have to keep track of them all right now. But there's the whole list. Obviously noodles, I mean, that's a pretty big one for ramen. But something I thought about that's also interesting is there's core ingredients that you need, things you can't get by without. But there's also extras. I throw a bunch of different extras in when I'm making ramen. I find shiitake mushrooms are helpful. A sweet potato adds some really nice richness to it. These aren't necessary. They're nice to have. They're things to evolve up to, and they're things that I found based on previous experience. And that's going to be important a little bit later. But what are the ingredients for threat intelligence? What are the things that you're going to kind of input into it to give you a base to start working through? Far and away, the number one thing, the number one place any threat intelligence capability should start is your own incidents. And there's generally two things that people say to me when I say this is the case. And either you say, we're already doing that, we know all about that, we're going through our incidents all the time, or people are saying, we don't keep track of that. This is one of the easiest and first things to solve in building a threat intelligence capability and improving your incident response capability as well, is having the idea of tracking incidents, getting all the details in place so that you can exploit those later on. Because without this information, you're guessing. You're thinking about a hypothetical and trying to find information that will support it. Your own incidents are the reality you're dealing with, and those are the things you need to be most able to respond to. Along with your incidents, and something that goes hand in hand with that, is your own teams. As an intelligence producer, one of the number one groups that I go to is my own SOC analysts, my own executives. What are you interested in? What do you need to know about? Tell me about that strange thing you saw once that you don't think was a big deal, but you didn't get a chance to look at in depth. Those types of hints, those types of pointers in a direction are things that a threat intelligence team needs to ingest and needs to be in a place to respond to. Vendor reports. Oh, I could probably do a whole talk just on vendor reports. They're valuable. I look at vendor reports when they come out, take the time to figure out if they're useful to me, and then either save them or get rid of them immediately. Sometimes they're useful just for good reading. They show me what someone else is seeing. But it's certainly something that I don't think is worth starting with, but is definitely something to build to being able to support taking those things in. Because, on the other side, nothing is worse than having an incident because you didn't check out the vendor report, because you didn't take the time to look it up and understand how it's relevant to your industry. Honeypots are another kind of interesting piece. I actually did end up writing about these once because I think they're such a loaded idea. They can be super useful. They can be a great input to a threat intelligence capability a little bit farther down the line. It's a maturity kind of play here that honeypots can be useful once you've done the basics. So remember when I referenced that idea of extras, the things that I added as I went through and kept building my ramen recipe? To me, honeypots is one of those extras. It's the sweet potato that I throw in a little bit later on. Peer and sharing committees, though, are a huge deal. I'm going to keep harping on Sergio's talk, and if you weren't here for it, I would check the video out later, simply because if you don't know the security folks at your biggest competitors and aren't having regular conversations with them, you are missing out on the richest source of opportunities. I worked at a defense contractor in the United States, and we never saw an attack that came against us that didn't also come against all of our big competitors. I see the same thing at GitHub. And our biggest competitors, we may compete when it comes to features and who should host code with us. We never compete when it comes to security. And we share information with them, they share information with us. And it really is oh gosh, now I'm gonna use an idiom. It's a rising tide raises all boats. Does that one mostly translate? I guess, okay. Anyway, peer and sharing communities. The other thing I love about these is they're largely free. And they're free if you approach it the right way. If you just reach out to the person on the other end and talk to them and open up a dialogue and have a conversation. Set up a chat room, use a vendor tool if that's important to you, but ultimately it's more about having the conversation and building the relationship. And last and not least is third-party paid intelligence. This is, again, one of those extras that I think you should probably consider once you've done the fundamentals first, simply because it's probably going to be relatively lower value, and it's going to come with a relatively high price tag. But again, if you have the opportunity available to you, you'd be dumb not to take advantage of it. So we got through inputs, we got through ingredients, we talked about the tools that we need, but that does not make you a bowl of ramen. There's a process. There's a method you have to use those tools on those ingredients in order to create the thing that you're ultimately trying to create. When you're talking about cooking, we'd call that a recipe. Here's my recipe for ramen, in case you're curious. And you're here, so I assume you are. Water to a boil, add a bunch of ingredients, wait 3 hours, and then prepare the extras. It's really pretty simple, ultimately. It's just a lot of chopping that I don't tell you about in this. So that's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. What about for threat intelligence? There are a lot of different processes you can follow as you build threat intelligence. I'm going to give you 2 that I think are particularly important to start with. One is this idea of F3EAD, and I should have broken that out. But F3EAD stands for find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate. And it's the idea of find is identify what you're trying to look for. Fix is figure out where it is in your environment. By the way, this is just intrusion detection. That's what the first 2 F's are. Finish is take care of the problem in your environment. That's your incident response action. And then we get to the intelligence portion of it, the EAD. And so exploit is take all that information that came out of your incident response and pull out the things that are going to be useful for generating intelligence. Are you grabbing all the pieces of malware and getting their hashes? Are you identifying all the IP addresses that were used by the adversary in the attack you just remediated? In a lot of cases, I find organizations get through the incident response process and then just stop. And then they're surprised when a few months later, those same tactics, those same processes are used against them. That's what this EAD piece is about. So exploit is pulling the useful things off of your incident response. Analyze is taking them and trying to identify answers to whatever questions you have. How do we detect them again? How could we have detected them faster? What do we know about the adversary and what they were after? The typical intelligence kind of questions that we ask. And the other key is disseminate. And disseminate is share with other people it's relevant to. Sometimes that means a 1-page executive summary that goes to your board. Sometimes that means a huge product that can go out to your incident response team that might be multiple pages. Remember the peer and communities bit I just referenced? Part of disseminate is reaching out to those partner organizations and saying, we just handled this. Here's what we saw. Sharing that information out. I think this is the best process for describing how an incident response team and a threat intelligence team can work together. Because the output from the disseminate side that goes back to the security operations team starts your next round of incidents. You're using that information. All you're doing is really just building a memory for a security operations team. You're building that idea that you keep track of this information so you don't forget. So next time when you see this, you're not quite so surprised. The other big process I think is really important, the other big recipe that I think is useful for threat intelligence teams, is this idea of RFIs. So an RFI is simply a request for intelligence or a request for information. And an RFI is simply having a standardized process by which different people throughout your organization, and it could be your executive team, it could be your security operations team, can ask questions of your intelligence team. And it seems like a common thing. It seems like an obvious piece. But formalizing this and giving a process to it will make it more likely to be used and will make it more likely to be effective. So I think taking the time and working out what this looks like inside your organization and how that communication flows, super important. It can just be as simple as having a email inbox that the intelligence team monitors and uses to send back responses. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't need to be tool-driven. But having that available will make people more likely to avail themselves of your intelligence team. And I touched on this a little bit in the dissemination phase, but the idea of lessons learned and practice. The first time I make a recipe, I basically assume I'm going to have to order pizza afterwards because I'm not going to make anything worth eating. Because the process matters. And familiarity builds confidence and builds the ability to do this more effectively in the future. So understand that as you're working through these processes, you're going to have to practice them, you're going to have to get better at them, and you're going to have to learn what things you can do to improve it in the future. I'm going to keep harping on that sweet potato because it's just the best example I have in the top of my head. But as soon as I tried that out, I realized this makes this better for the future. And so I made it part of my formal recipe to say, every time I'm going to make ramen, I need to have a sweet potato available because I'm going to put it in there. That's this kind of iterative process that we get. Another quote, this was supposed to be my quote from Alex Atala. Okay, I'm also getting a Portuguese lesson in this. This is great. And he had this idea of, he had a better quote than this one from Charlie Trotter, about the idea that you need to understand your ingredients. And you need to understand how they evolve throughout the process of going through a recipe. And I thought that was pretty apropos. So the last thing I haven't really talked about, my 4 things, is the idea of cooks. The idea of the people who are working through this process. And Gordon Ramsay, aside from yelling at people really loudly, did make this point that if you want to be a great chef, you have to work with great chefs. And in fact, chefs have a whole formalized process for this. It's called a stage. And it's the idea of basically, it's an internship, but it's an internship for cooks, where you go and spend time working in kitchens of people who you respect and want to be like. And I think that this is something we don't talk enough about for intelligence teams, is how do we do this for them? And I think you can divide it up into 3 different pieces. Great cooks and great intel analysts consume. You can't be a great cook if you're not eating good food. I would argue you can't be a great threat intelligence analyst if you're not reading great threat intelligence. I read reports that have nothing to do with my organization simply because I believe they're good intelligence, they're good products, and I want to learn from them as much about the process as I want to learn about the output. So I think that there needs to be time to consume good intelligence in order to create good intelligence. Now, the next part of that is this idea of create. You can't become a great cook if you're not going to spend time in the kitchen actually cooking things. You get better with repetition. You get better with experience. You get better having made mistakes so that you know how to fix them in the future. I would again argue a great threat intel team can't be great if they're not putting out products on a regular basis. And so this is why I've seen threat intel teams that say, well, we'll write a report when there's something worth reporting. Well, first of all, I think there's always something worth reporting. I think you're crazy if you're not looking hard enough if you don't have things in your environment you want to talk about on the regular. But I think the other thing is it's important to do that regularly simply to get better at doing it and to constantly ask the question of the people you're sending your products to, how could this have been more useful? How could this have been better? What would have made this product more useful for you? And then feeding those things back into your processes, your ingredients, and your tools. And that really gets to this idea of growth. It's dangerous to think we've got it. It's dangerous to think we know what it's supposed to look like and be done with it. Another great piece of reaching out to partner organizations is this idea of looking at them and going, what are you doing? What's working for you? And taking the time to ingest those ideas and think about how you can integrate them into your own processes. So finally, we have the output. And this is the whole goal. This is where we're ultimately going. And this was supposed to show an amazing picture of my own ramen that I made. And if it wasn't right after lunch, was going to make you really hungry. Just imagine, it's beautiful. But the idea is there's supposed to be an output from this. I've talked through this whole thing about the process is getting you to an end goal. When it's cooking, that end goal is dinner. But when it's threat intelligence, your goal is to be outputting things that are going to be useful for your organization and making it more effective. No matter who they're going to, no matter who the ultimate stakeholder you're sharing it to is, there's supposed to be an output you're coming up with. What that looks like is very organization specific, and I'm not going to tell you what the right way to do it is, but you don't want to get caught up in the idea of doing intelligence for intelligence sake. You're supposed to be working to build a product that goes out to a customer. So that's the basis. That's to me, the four things you need to make sure you're addressing in how you build a threat intelligence capability. And I appreciate you all going with me on this crazy metaphor that I put together, but I thought it was really important because in both cases, we're really trying to do the same things. Think about your tools and think about what they're enabling you to do. And think about what they're holding you back from. We are both empowered and sometimes limited by our tools. And that doesn't mean we have an excuse. That means sometimes a tool's not worth using. You need to consider that as well as getting something just because it's the new whiz-bang thing. Get to know and understand your inputs. We're only as good as we know those sources of information and can use them effectively and understand how they work with our processes and understand how they work with our different tools. Build your processes, practice them, understand them, enhance them, share them. I don't think sharing process can be emphasized enough. And too many security teams think the best thing they can do is hide it and keep it all to themselves. I come out and share this stuff partially because, hey, I want you to know what I know, but I'm also really looking forward to the person who comes up to me afterwards and goes, did you think about this? Did you consider the ramifications of that? That helps me to grow as well. And then lastly, and I think most important, grow your people. An Intel team, no matter how good the tools, is only going to be as good as the people they have using them. You can have the best input, a great process, and amazing tools, but those people are who make it all come together and make it all work. I can give anyone my ramen recipe who's curious about it. It's up on GitHub. It's pretty great. If you want to follow me, I am on the Twitter and a couple other places. I did just release a book. I think Alex might have alluded to that. Okay, with Rebecca Brown, that goes into all this. I'm sorry there are no recipes in it, but it is hopefully another take on how to use this F380 stuff to enhance intrusion detection and incident response. Thanks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.